Hey everybody, Danny Roddy. Thank you for clicking on this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. I know I've been gone a little bit, but I was buying this microphone, so hopefully this sounds better. If it does or doesn't, please leave a comment in the comment section. And again, just thank you for watching. These videos are always fun because of all the comments, criticisms, and feedback I get. So I sincerely appreciate you watching. With that, I wanted to get in today's video. A lot of times in the comments, I'll post a video about the pathology of baldness, and people will be like, well, that's great, but how do I apply this information? And it's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't kind of situation, because people have a lot of ideological views about diet and nutrition. And so when they see something that maybe conflicts with their current views, it's just like an automatic turnoff. And so I think it's important to talk about the pathology, and then that can inform the dietary choices. And the opposite of that would be like, well, I'm a vegan, or I'm a vegetarian, or I'm paleo, and then try to fix the problem, because I think that could be in conflict with how the problem is actually manifesting itself. So that's something to think about, and why I don't love talking about like the nutritional aspects, because sometimes I think it's just kind of worthless without understanding how the problem is actually working. So with that, keep an open mind if you possibly can. I myself, I was a vegan, vegetarian, paleo, zero carb. So I completely understand the mindset. Like, I had many arguments where I just left angry, and why doesn't this person understand what I'm trying to say? So I completely understand that mentality. And before we get into the food choices, I think if you're arbitrarily restricting your calories, I think that can be detrimental to hair. So sometimes I'll be talking to people for a long time, and they'll be like, I'm eating everything right, I'm taking thyroid, I'm taking aspirin, and my hair's still falling out. And then they'll put their food into something like chronometer.com, and they'll be eating like 1,000 calories a day. So just don't have that be you. And make sure you're eating to appetite. And I think the appetite is just by far the best way to know if you're eating enough. So I think that's a strong biological signal that should be paid attention to. And with that, use something like chronometer.com, because if you're not charting at least once, like you might just not have any idea how much protein, carbohydrate, vitamins, and nutrients you're getting. So it will just make life harder, I think, without having any idea and never putting those things to paper or chronometer.com. And then finally, just a word on myself. For myself, I'm an advocate of simplicity. And so another thing, I'll constantly be talking to people on email, and they'll be eating like 50 different things. And if they have a digestive problem, or they're experiencing intermittent inflammation, or like scalp inflammation or hair loss or something like that, I think it can be really tricky to try to figure out like, okay, well, what of these 50 foods is causing my issue? And so that can be really hard. So I don't think like a really restrictive diet is like that great. I think the diet has to be satisfying, or it won't be sustainable long term. But that being said, you can choose like a few different foods, and they can be so nutritious, like liver, oysters, and milk and stuff. Those and eggs, and those are really nutritious foods, and you could compose a diet out of those because they're so nutritious. So this is something to think about when you're troubleshooting an issue. So for what it's worth. My first suggestion, and something I've long known to be a problem when going through various lab tests of people I talk to, lab tests I find on hair loss forums, and then also the pathology of baldness, which I've talked about a few times, is a high calcium to phosphate ratio. So I think, let me explain why this is important for baldness, and then I'll talk about more why calcium specifically is important. So bone loss is something that happens in baldness. And a study from, I forget the year, but they said balding men average 5% lower total bone mineral density. And a lot of times baldness is similar to bone loss, and things that build bone also typically help to promote hair growth. So that's just like a general rule of thumb, I think. Calcium and phosphate. Phosphate is in all foods, and calcium is also in all foods, but to a much lesser degree. So it's very easy to get an abundance of phosphate versus calcium. And when you get too much phosphate, you turn on your parathyroid glands, which are 4 glands that sit, I think, on top of your thyroid. And those glands secrete parathyroid hormone, which in excess is inflammatory. So this study from 2010 says an excessive dietary phosphate intake alone can be deleterious to bone through increased parathyroid hormone secretion, but adverse effects on bone increase when dietary calcium intake is low. In many countries, phosphate intake is abundant, whereas calcium intake fails to meet recommendations. An optimal dietary calcium phosphate ratio is therefore difficult to achieve. And these findings suggest that in habitual diets, low calcium to phosphate ratios may interfere with homeostasis of calcium metabolism and increase bone resorption as indicated by higher parathyroid hormone and calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone might be involved in hair loss and skin aging. Thus, PTH may play an important role in the normal physiology of skin, and their agonists and antagonists have potentially wide therapeutic applications in the treatment of hyperproliferative skin disorders and aging skin, and could be effective for stimulating and maintaining hair growth. And also, the parathyroid hormone is associated with metabolic syndrome and things like that. I think it strongly suppresses the use of oxygen, creating the stress situation. And so if you get a lab test, you can get the phosphate, you can get the parathyroid hormone, you can get the prolactin, and parathyroid hormone increases prolactin and vice versa. And the phosphate, I don't know if anybody knows the optimal amount of phosphate in the blood, but one study suggested that 3.5 and under was good. And sometimes I'll see people with 4 and over. And I think Ray Pete mentioned that around 3 was good. So if your phosphate is high, or parathyroid hormone is high, or your prolactin is high, and your vitamin D is low, or you know for a fact that you eat way more phosphate, it might be having deleterious effects on your bones and also hair. So number one suggestion, eat more calcium. And the calcium foods are like milk, cheese, some well-cooked kale and spinach are good sources of calcium. If none of those work, eggshell calcium can also be used, but sometimes it's hard on the stomach, so you might want to eat it with a meal. And if you can't drink milk, you might want to investigate why, especially if you could drink it when you were a kid and you can't drink it now. So that can sometimes be related to the ecology of the intestine. So also something to look out for. Okay, so next suggestion would be 80 to 100 grams of protein, which is actually quite a lot of protein. So there's been a trend in both like paleo and of course like vegan and vegetarian worlds, and they're like, nobody needs protein, and protein is everything. So I think especially for baldness, where at least I suspect that the liver is a big issue in baldness, protein can have, or the right kinds of protein can have a huge therapeutic effect. So the 80 to 100 grams recommendation is the MRDA for protein. And this was an amount that they found was supportive of soldiers in stressful combat situations. So if you want to think of like life as a stressful combat situation, it might be good to get a certain amount of protein. The need for protein generally increases in all kinds of illness, and especially like systemic infections and burn patients. They can eat lots of protein. The amount of albumin, which is a protein that the liver secretes, is correlated with the protein intake. So I wanted to read this one from 1976. They said the serum albumin showed significant correlation with the protein content of the growing hair root bulbs. There was significant correlation between the percentage of growing hairs, their bulb diameters, and protein content, which in turn correlated with protein intake of the subject. Obviously, milk and cheese are great sources of protein, and they also come prepackaged with IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1. I'm trying to write an article about that, but it seems to be some evidence to suggest it's deficient in pattern baldness, and it has like an inverse relationship with this inflammatory cytokine called, I forget the full name, but it's TGF-B1, and this appears to be a promoter of fibrosis, or I think one study called it like the main switch of fibrosis in androgenic alopecia, so-called. And so I know they say this growth is part of cancer, but I am extremely skeptical given the respiratory ideas of cancer, and blaming IGF-1 doesn't really make that much sense to me. So for what it's worth. So I did have an article on this, the centrality of the liver, and explains a little bit about IGF-1, but obviously milk and cheese are good protein sources. They have calcium, IGF-1, other substances. Glycine found in gelatinous cuts of meat, like lamb shank and oxtail, are good. Chicharron, if you can find them. Mushrooms are a good source of fungal protein, and they have lots of anti-estrogenic qualities and are nutritious. And I think they're apigenin. They have an anti-inflammatory substance in them too. And then like supplemental proteins like eggs, ruminant liver, and oysters. And eating like a portion of liver and oysters once a week, I think can be much better than taking some kind of multivitamin with many different ingredients that are all potentially allergenic. So the third suggestion would be an emphasis on sugars versus starches. And so this will obviously be probably a controversial recommendation, but I think fructose has really been malaligned. And just going back to the Montagna paper where they say like the hair follicle needs energy substrate, it can't use fatty acids, it has a glutamine glucose cycle, so too much like free glutamine turns off the hair follicle's energy metabolism with glucose. And fructose is a great energy substance, and it can be used when even free fatty acids are blocking the use of glucose. I'm not sure if the exact same thing happens in the hair follicle, but it's good for diabetics. And there's just like endless amounts of propaganda against fructose. And it increases G6-PDH, which I've talked about in other videos, but this is an enzyme in the pentose phosphate cycle, which there was a paper that suggested that it was suppressed in those with pattern baldness. The other benefit of fructose is it lowers phosphate, so it can have a beneficial effect on parathyroid hormone, and because parathyroid hormone increases prolactin and vice versa. And it's just a general liver protectant substance. And the last, and I won't belabor the last point because I know this video is already kind of long, but an emphasis on saturated fats over polyunsaturated fats. And I've gone over this on other videos. I won't beat a dead horse, but the polyunsaturated fats are substrates for prostaglandins, which are involved in baldness, and also lipid peroxidation, which is also involved in baldness. And so I think these fats are so fragile. And this is another, I think, error in nutrition, that people believe that there are essential fatty acids, so EPA and DHA, and both of those have deleterious effects. And so I think DHA is a source of acrolein. That's a breakdown product, and acrolein has a bunch of toxic effects. And so you won't often read about this unless you're maybe tuned into Ray Peat's work, but this stuff is very basic, and it's kind of glossed over or never touched by a lot of people talking about the essentiality of these fats. So something to think about. Again, do your own research. But I think one of the main things, besides the prostaglandins and prostaglandin PGD2 being involved directly in hair loss and defining the baldness field, the PUFA inhibits the G6-PDH. I don't know if anybody knows the exact amount that's the best for the diet. For what it's worth, I think Ray has said that 4 grams per 2,000 calories was good. And so that might be a number to shoot for. I'm going to leave it right there. Thank you guys so much for watching. There's more detail in this kind of realm of nutrition and hair loss in Organizing the Panic, so you can check that out if you're motivated. Also check out the Facebook page and the photos section, which I try to post content there every day. Check out the Patreon if you're motivated. That's how I fund all my work and doing these videos and paying for fancy new mics and stuff like that. Hopefully it sounds better. Again, tell me what you think. But if you don't want to do any of that, just hit the like button, and that's amazing and really helps. And leave any comments and constructive criticisms below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I sincerely appreciate it, and I'll talk to you guys soon.